Hello everybody. Recently I wanted to see if I could auto-generate background music for things like videos in video games. And on the suggestions from a friend, I thought an interesting way to do this would be with probabilistic maths. The only problem with this idea is that I am terrible at maths, coding and music. But luckily I lie right at the top of the graph of the Dunning-Kruger effect, so I'm dumb enough to think that I can do it. So MIDI files require four main pieces of information. That's the type of note, whether it's like a D or a C, the duration of the note, the time in which the note takes place, and the volume of the note. So the first thing you want to do is calculate what note we want to place. So if we say we're in C major, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. So for the probability, I wanted to use Markov chains, which is the idea that the probability of a thing occurring is based exclusively on the thing that occurred before it. So for example, if we're at C, it can go to itself, it can go to D, and it can go to E and F and G and A and B. So for example, it might go to G 30% of the time. It might go to F 20% of the time. It might go back to C 10% of the time. So if we go through and fill it out for the rest of these notes for D, E, F, G, A, and B, we end up with a huge mess of lines. But if you want to, you can write it out in a matrix. And this matrix is read from kind of left to top, if that makes sense. So in this example, C to C is 10% of the time. And if we fill it out for the rest of C, that's the probabilities that C goes to the next note. And this is just useful for using it mathematically, like if you want to multiply matrices by row vectors and things like that. So with this, we can now kind of create melodies. We can predict which notes should follow which notes. But the next thing we need to do is work out the duration of those notes. The best way I've found to determine the duration of the notes is based on the time. So if we break the time up into kind of a bar system, MIDI usually uses like a quarter note meaning 1. So if we say 4 quarter notes is a bar, as normal music does, then we can say, 4 quarter notes is a bar, 2 is a half bar, obviously 1 is a quarter, half of that is an eighth, and half of that is a 16th. I didn't go any further than this, but you totally could, but I thought 16th was kind of the smallest interval I needed. Now we have a way of tracking the time, it's much easier to set the duration. For example, if you're at the start of the bar, what's most likely to be there? It's either going to be a whole note, or a half note, or a quarter note. And if you're a quarter of the way in the bar, what's most likely to be there? It's probably a quarter note. And if you're 2 quarters, then it can kind of be a half. And if you're, 3 quarters in, or somewhere in between, it might be like a 16th. I just found that basing it on time, rather than just doing it randomly, it gives music that sounds a lot more realistic and a lot more on beat. Another thing to consider is space. Every single time you can play a note, you might not want to play a note. And I found the easiest way to implement these spaces is to kind of encode it as if it was a note, but when it actually comes to writing the MIDI information, kind of skip it, but still as if it had occurred. So it essentially acts as a space. Obviously, music isn't just a bunch of melodies, so I wanted to add the ability to encode for chords. And how this works is it essentially generates the melody, and then runs through the melody, and for each note it says how likely is this to occur with another note. So for example, it's really likely that a root note, like the first note, occurs with the third and the fifth, to make a major chord. And the second note occurs with the fourth and the sixth to make a second minor. And it kind of does this for each note, and how many notes that go with each thing, and the weight in is kind of determined by the user. If my explanation's been any good, hopefully you should have some understanding of how this works now. As it's all based on weightings and stuff, obviously different presets create different types of music. And it's really interesting kind of messing around with the file and changing the weightings of one note to another note, or what occurs in the first quarter note and things like that. I think it has a lot of variability, and I'm interested to kind of develop it so it can do things like percussion and maybe imitate certain types of music. I'm not 100% sure what I want to add yet, or if I want to make a GUI and things like that. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, but here's a little snippet I made. I made it in Ableton. I'm not the best at producing, but I think it gave a pretty good example of how everything works.